Salvador Alvarenga. He was 37 years old, a fisherman, made his living on the water, and working out of Mexico. It was November 18th, 2012. He was loading his 24-foot fiberglass craft. It was no roof, no cabin, just a boat. In fact, we can throw a picture of it up on the screen. You can see what his boat looked like. November 18th, 2012, he's loading it up. His regular guy couldn't be there, so he had hired a rookie, a 22-year-old by the last name of Cordoba. It was Ezekiel Cordoba. And they load about 1,000 pounds of gear into the boat, including, I don't know if you can see it, that big blue chest in the middle. That's almost like a freezer, if it was no electricity on it. And that's where they would put their catch. The goal was to go out about 10 a.m. in the morning on the 18th and to fish straight through till about 4 p.m. the next day. And typically within a period of time like that, he could make enough money to survive for a week or two. And so that was the plan. And they were going to fill it with shark and mahi-mahi and all sorts of different fish that they would catch and fill the cooler with. And so they go out. There was report of weather that might be moving in, but it had not hit where they were, at least not yet. And so they go out and begin making their way out about 75 miles out, which is a long ways in a craft like that. About 75 miles out, he begins to put out his 2 miles of fishing line. And so he's running long lines. If you ever watched any of the shows on fishing, some of these guys do long lines. It's a dangerous occupation. But and so he's putting out his long lines, and they just, then there's waiting. And then you check the lines, and that's the process. And so somewhere around 1 a.m., this storm that he had heard about finally started making its way from land toward the sea where they were, and the waves started picking up and then splashing over the rail. And so he's telling Cordoba to bail the water. And so Cordoba is bailing water, and Salvador's trying to run the lines in and check the lines, and the water's kind of getting rowdier and more water's coming in, and so they're bailing harder, and he's trying to run faster, and it's a fever pitch. This thing is happening, and it's chaos because the wind's now blowing, the waves are starting to crash, and the boat's starting to get water in it, and they could not bail fast enough to keep the water out without getting swamped. Finally, he has to cut his lines and let his gear and whatever fish are on it go to the bottom. And so at this point, they've decided the best thing to do is try to make it back. It's a 6-hour boat ride back to land. And so he fires up his outboard, and they're motoring back as fast as they can, given the waves and the crashes. You can't go full speed in that kind of wind. And at this point now, the wind is just howling, just a fever pitch of a howl, just blowing offshore straight out to sea. And they're fighting it back in, and hour after hour, they're getting closer. Finally, he said in the dawn of the morning, he believed he could make out the mountaintops in the distance. And so he figured he was about 15 miles maybe off land. And that's when the motor coughed. And then it coughed again. And then it quit. And so immediately, this wind that is ripping off land begins to carry them out, and he's pulling feverishly on the cord of the motor, trying to get it to fire back up again until he snaps the line, and they begin to drift. And now they've got to start throwing stuff overboard because they're taking on more water than they can stand. And so all their catch and whatever else is on the boat, they try to unload the weight and bail water. And the wind the whole time is just pushing them like they have a sail up, just scalding back out to the sea away from land. And it blows like that all day long. He had radioed right about the time the motor died. He got on the radio, and just before it died, he cracked a few times, and he tried to radio people on land to let them know where he was, and nobody really could figure out. They got a message, but they couldn't tell where he was located based on what he said, and then his radio died. And so there they are, being pushed out to sea, him and his greenhorn, Cordoba. And this wind blew at gale force for 5 straight days. And when it finally settled down, they were 280 miles offshore in the Pacific Ocean. he said that the thirst and the hunger was excruciating. He said he was so hungry he was eating his own fingernails. Finally, on day 9, it rained. And he said they were so excited they took their clothes off, danced around in the boat in the rain, lapped up as much of it as they could, and they were able to fill 5 gallons worth of fresh water from some containers that they had found floating in the ocean. And that's what they subsisted on for the following days and weeks ahead. Salvador would catch fish by hand, these little bony fish that would swim around his boat. He would catch them, and they would eat that. But it was a meager existence at best. They would ration the water. And this is how they survived day after day, night after night. Days turned into weeks. They're still out in the Pacific Ocean, just floating. And they were so far out that they had lost hope that any type of fishing vessel would find them. They prayed that they'd be spotted by an airplane or maybe some type of cargo ship. But their vessel was so small, as you can see in the picture, it sat so low in the water that they knew anybody beyond just a half a mile out would never see them. But they prayed and they waited. In the daytime, it felt like they were going to burn to death. And at nighttime, it felt like they were going to freeze. And so they would get inside of that cooler in the middle of the boat during the day and during the night. They had to get in there in the daytime to keep the sun off of them, and then back in there in the nighttime to keep from shivering all night long. And they would use the mornings and the evenings to try to fish and relax. He said they started off as strangers. This guy that he'd never met before and hired for the first time, who knew nothing, within a few short weeks of being stranded at sea, they were best friends. They would lay on the deck in the evening time before it got too cold and stare at the stars together and occupy their time and try to have some fun just by creating constellations out of the stars. Who could be the most creative with the stars? So, and then they would end up inside the cooler to stay warm, inside that freezer chest on the boat, and Cordoba would sing hymns as they would strengthen their faith through the night. And weeks turned into months. And they're floating, and nobody's come. And they're eating what fish they can find. One night during the night, they hear something bump into the boat. Salvador peeks out, and it's a turtle. Excitedly, he pulls it in, and that becomes their next meal. He said we could eat the flesh of the turtle. He said we could actually drink their Merlot-colored blood, and it would help with our thirst. Cordoba was not as excited about the turtles. So Salvador, in an effort to help his friend think differently, would cut the turtle into thin strips and put it on the outboard motor and let it cook in the sun, and then take some of the bones from the fish that they'd eaten and make hors d'oeuvres for him. Yeah, it's a mind game, right? But he said that the hunger actually had brought them to the brink of sanity. And then one evening, laying on the deck before it got too cold to stand it, Cordova awoke from a slumber and screamed out, "I want oranges! Give me some oranges!" And so Salvador said, "All right, I'm going to the store." He said he got up and he walked the length of the boat, hung out for about 5 minutes, and came back, said it was closed. Said they'll open again in the morning. He said at which point it seemed to satisfy Cordoba, and in their delirium, he accepted that answer and he went back to sleep. And such was the mental games that they played week in and week out. And 1 month turned into 2, and 2 months turned into 3, and 3 months turned into 4. Somewhere close to a year, they reckoned that it was probably near Christmas. And at this point, their cuisine had expanded to include seabirds. Every now and then a seabird would land on their boat, and they'd take advantage of that. And they thought, well, let's make ourselves a Christmas dinner. They had captured a couple of seabirds, regardless, who knows what time of the year it really was. And so that was going to be their Christmas meal, regardless of what time they were actually celebrating it. And so they prepared it, and they ate, and shortly after the meal, Cordoba clenched his gut and began to moan, and foam started coming out of his mouth, and something was wrong. They tried to figure out what had happened, and so they tore the bird apart that he had eaten and found a poisonous snake in its belly. So they reasoned maybe he got infected from that. He recovered physically. Salvador said that he never really recovered emotionally from that. From there on, he was disgusted at the sight of raw meat, withdrew from food altogether, began to waste away. Said his arms became closer to toothpicks, that his legs were the size of a forearm. And he just slowly began to starve to death. He would encourage his friend, try to feed him, try to give him water. At one point, Cordoba says, I'm just going to jump into the ocean. I'd rather die there than starve to death. Salvador grabbed him and threw him into the cooler and sat on the lid. Cordoba thrashed around for a bit, and when he finally stopped, he opened the lid, and they had a conversation. He said, you cannot die. We have to share our story. A few weeks later, Cordoba was sitting on the bow of the boat, and he said to Salvador, I'm dying. Salvador grabs the water and gives him a drink and begins to weep. And he said, please don't die. Please don't leave me here alone. And he said a few minutes later, his friend passed away. He said he laid his body out on the seat of the boat like he was sunbathing. And he would talk to him. He left him laying there. The next day he got up out of the cooler and asked Cordoba, did you have a good night's sleep? And he would chat with him throughout the day while he laid there. Like, where do you think we are now? You think we're going to get rescued today? And this went on for 2 days and 3 days, 4 days. Emotionally, he was trying to deal with the fact that he was alone. On day 6, he slid the lifeless, emaciated body of his friend into the Pacific waters. And he went and got in the freezer. And he said for hours he just bawled. Now, it was real, and he was all alone. And it had been at least a year out on the water by himself, just adrift, had no idea where he was or if he would ever be found. He would try to occupy his time, since he was solo, in various activities. He liked to hunt for the turtles. He liked to fish, and so he could maintain some mental acuity trying to focus on that, keeping himself distracted from the fact that, it had been so long and that he was still alone. He decided he needed to get off the boat one way or the other, and so he was going to swim occasionally. But it's shark-infested water, so he devised a shark detection system. And he would throw some remnants of food, normally bird's feet or something, into the water and see what happened. And if nothing got too crazy, then he would calmly slide himself off the boat into the water, not to make too many ripples. And he'd swim around for a little while. And he said there's some small fish that lived under his boat. He said, and if they got nervous, he got nervous. And he'd get back on. And so each day he would try to find some time just to get out of the boat and swim around in the water a little bit. Just a mental break. And this again went on for weeks by himself, subsisting on meagerness. Then one day on the horizon there was a cargo ship, and it's headed his direction. And it got closer and closer and closer until he felt like this ship is absolutely going to run his boat over. It passed him just 50 yards from him. And he's waving his hands and he's shouting, and some guys appear on the deck and see him, and they wave back, and he watches this ship. The reaction was perfect, thank you. Yeah. Just go off over the horizon. Didn't stop, didn't turn around. And he said, and that was a turning point for him mentally. From there, he had begun to give up. He reasoned that he'd been at sea for over a year at this point. And he now has lost his appetite for food and preferred rather just to close his eyes. He recalled seeing the look on his friend's face as he neared the end, and just the hollowness of his eyes, and just a desire to be done. And he thought, I was feeling that. And he said to himself, I believe I'm being tested. By all accounts, I should have been dead by now already. And maybe God's going to use me. And so he would pray, God, give me another chance. He had family that he hadn't seen in years. He said, God, give me another chance. I'll be a family man. He dreamed of having a farm and animals and a clutch of children, he said. He thought if I could just get the chance to share my story, maybe it would be hope for those who are considering suicide. He thought, what could be worse than this? Lost, alone, months at sea. 430 plus days all total. On one particular day toward the end, the coconut bumped into his boat. A short time after that, he began to see shorebirds. And then in the distance, over the horizon, a small island. He said it took everything in him not to jump off the boat and try to swim for it. But he knew he'd be unlikely to make it, both in his condition and because of the sharks. So he waited. 10 yards out, he leapt from the bow of the boat into the waters and swam. The waves carried him up on the beach, and when they backed off, he was left there on the sand, clutching what he said was a handful of sand, the most precious thing he had seen in over a year. He had made the most incredible voyage in the history of the sea. But to our knowledge, nobody's been out any longer than that. 430 some days. He had traveled over 5,000 miles. His clothes were tattered. The only thing he had left on was a sweatshirt that was wholly and ripped, and a pair of underwear that weren't doing so well either. If he had missed that island, his next stop would have been the Philippines, 3,000 miles away. He landed on the island of Eben Atoll. It was a southern tip of the Marshall Islands, one of the most remote spots on the earth. Basically, a deserted island had one couple residing on it. They found him and began the process of nursing him back to health. Salvador had one of the most remarkable voyages in the history of seafaring. He didn't navigate, he didn't sail, he didn't paddle, he didn't row. He drifted. When we open the book of Hebrews to chapter 2, we find the word drift. It says, we must therefore pay even more attention to what we've heard so that we will not drift. And whenever the writer of Hebrews wrote this to this community, these were seafaring people. I mean, that was a lot of their commerce, even a lot of their travel involved the sea. And so when he brought in the word drift, it would have brought in some emotion for them. They would have recognized this is a negative, dangerous term. Drifting, man, that is detrimental. That is something that you don't want to do out in any ocean or sea or body of water. You want to just drift. He says, hey, we've got to pay even more attention to what we've heard so that we don't drift. So that we stay anchored, if you want to put it in the positive light. Drifting is bad, anchoring is good. And so that we stay anchored. He said, hey man, we've got to stay anchored. We can't just be out there drifting because it's not going to take you anywhere good and it's going to be bad, and we can't allow that. We've got to pay more attention to the things that you know to be true so that you stay anchored on that. And that anchor for the believer is Christ. And not just the name Jesus, which that's a big deal. We believe in his name. And he says, those who believe in my name will become children of God. And so that's a big deal. But the supremacy of Christ. And that's what the whole book is teaching us, that Jesus is superior. And so he started off talking about the angels, and he's still on them through chapter 2, that Jesus is still superior to all of that. And he's going to bring the angels back up in just a minute. But he's saying for the believer, we have to come to back to this idea that, man, Jesus is supreme. Not just, in theology. I mean, we would all know that. If we had to write it down, at least for most of us, we would agree to that. Yeah, Jesus is supreme and he's God. But it's more than that. Jesus has to be supreme in our lives. And here's what that means. It means that we've got to come back to the value of Christ. There's going to be scenarios in this life that are going to tempt us to not value Jesus as he should be valued. It's going to tempt us to maybe stray from our Christian anchor, our Christian roots, to respond in ways that are not Christian, to act in ways that are not Christian, to think in ways that are not Christian. And so to resist that is going to cost us something. And we can put it in simple terminology, this easy stuff. But for the Hebrew believers, here's what it was. They were being threatened. Their very lives were being threatened. Their livelihoods were being threatened. Their way of living was being threatened. And so to follow Christ for them meant that it might mean costing them everything. And so there's this idea where, they didn't want to give up everything. When they began to follow Christ, it was, yes, I want salvation, but I don't want to, give this up. And that is still a problem we have in our society today. We still struggle with the same thing. People, they want the salvation that Jesus provides, but they don't want to have to sacrifice their lives. And then somebody put it like this: we want the crown without the cross. Well, that's not how it works. And so he's bringing us back to this idea where we have to see that Jesus is valuable enough to sacrifice for, that he is supreme value, that we're willing to give up anything for him. And that is the anchor of the believer. And if that's not where we are, then we are kind of drifting. We're adrift, and it is dangerous. And I don't know how far it's going to take you, how long it's going to keep you out there, and what it's going to cost you. And so he's saying we've got to get back to the idea where Jesus is supreme in our lives, where he's valuable and he's worthy of everything. The winds that push us are mostly winds of emotion, if we're honest with ourselves. Sometimes it's difficult to maintain that Christian response. In some of life's storms, we want to revert to, the nature and the flesh, and we want to, get wrapped up, and we want to respond in anger or hate or vengeance or, lust or greed or selfishness or whatever the emotion might be. These are the same, don't make a mistake about it, these are the same emotions that have tempted believers from the very beginning. For the last 2,000 years, we have struggled all with the same emotions. For the Hebrew believers, I want to follow Jesus, but I don't want to have to give up. And you can name it. I want it to have to cost me, and you can name it. So there's this temptation to, maybe not all the way in with Jesus because of the cost. And sometimes there's going to be temptations for us to, pull back just a little bit because we want to do things our way, and we want to satisfy us, and we want to make it about us, and, and the intensity perhaps changes based on the situation. But otherwise, we're faced daily with the temptation, don't miss this, to abandon Christ. If even for a moment, not to wholesale abandon, but maybe in the moment, in order to satisfy some fleshly or emotional or temporary desire, we're tempted to abandon. And such abandonment or such drifting involves the devaluation of Jesus in our lives. Somewhere along the course of our drifting, we stop seeing Jesus as worthy of our sacrifice. To follow Christ as he deserves requires sacrifice. It's going to cost you something. And then it's that he's told us that from the beginning, from the very beginning of his interaction with the Jewish people. He taught them, hey, sacrifice is involved with worship. And it's no different now. It's going to cost you something. And it's whenever we start limiting the cost that we're saying with our lives or our attitude or our behavior that Jesus is not superior. He's not supreme. He does not exist above my wants or my perceived needs or my desires. Thus, Jesus is not worthy of my sacrifice. He says, and that is the definition of spiritual drifting right there. And whenever we start doing that, then we are adrift. If we say that he's not worthy, it's too hard, or, I want what I want when I want it. And maybe you're not saying that verbally, but if you're doing it with your actions, your attitude, then you're saying that he's not worthy of me sacrificing the things that I want or I desire. And for many people, the drifting was nothing that's happened intentionally. It's just over time you've made so many of these decisions where, no, I'm not going to sacrifice that, and I'm going to do this my way, or I'm going to say what I want to say because that pleases the flesh, and I'm going to respond the way I want to respond because I'm in the moment, and you cut me off in traffic, and you're going to know about it. We're trying to teach our kids the horn should not be used emotionally. It's designed for protection. Somebody don't see you, give them a toot-toot. But if somebody does something you don't like, it's not, hey, buddy, bam. It's not one of those, right? It's that's the non-Christian emotional response. And there is some satisfaction to the flesh in that, right? And so we're tempted by that. And that is just a small picture of what happens on much grander scales throughout our lives. These temptations that we face are all desired to draw us away, to push us away, to make us drift away from Christ into some degree of self-satisfaction, selfishness. It starts with just a choice, some spiritual laziness. Like, I don't feel like reading my Bible today. It's something that's that simple, and that's the first step. I'll pray tomorrow. Step 2. I'll shade in the colors on the tax return. Step 3. And then this is these little things that we keep doing that we're saying, you know what? Living the Christian life the way that pleases God is not worth it because it's costing me too much. I can't afford that financially. I can't afford that emotionally, and I don't want to give that up. And then, there's greed, and then you bring lust into it. And so many people's like, I'm going to do it my way because it feels good. And I find this, even more prevalent among adults. You guys, you realize that the standard of Scripture is there's no sex unless you're married, right? Y'all know this? Well, I know that's an adult theme. I don't know how many kids we got in here, but you can talk about it with them later. That's it. It's in here. I can prove it to you. And yet we continue to throw that out. Why? But because this is what we want. Well, it ain't about you. It's about either Jesus is worthy of the sacrifice or he's not. And if he's not, then you're not Christian. And that's what it boils down to, because to be Christian means to be Christ-like. It has a meaning. There's meaning in that word. And so we have to, at some point, realize, hey, yeah, there is going to be sacrifice involved with following Christ. This, living for Jesus and the American dream really don't work. There's more to it. It's at some point we've got to realize if he's truly valuable, then I'm okay with whatever the cost is. Emotionally, sometimes it's not going to feel good. Physically, sometimes it's not going to feel good. Financially, sometimes it's not going to feel good. But as long as he's the most valuable thing, then those other things just kind of pale in comparison. And when he's not the most valuable thing, then we are full set on adrift away from the anchor of our soul, which is the value of Christ, which is what the Hebrews is talking about. Hey, we've got to get back to this thing where Jesus is valuable, more valuable than your experience, more valuable than your wants, more valuable than your safety, more valuable than your pleasure, more valuable than your stuff. Where we're willing to say, hey, if it costs me everything, okay. And I'm not saying that's an easy position to get to. I'm just saying that's the right position to get to. That's what it means to follow Christ. And people, we've been saying it for years. Well, I'm going to get back after it, and I'm going to get back in the groove, and I'm going to start doing right again. And Pastor, I'm going to come back to church. We've been out for a long time, and it's just because we're so... Go back and read the book of Haggai. Read the book of Malachi. A couple of Old Testament prophets. People had the same excuse then. Isn't that amazing? That's amazing to me that we've been using the same excuse this long and nobody's calling nobody out on it. Well, the prophets did. They called them out on it. Because here was one of the scenarios they gave them. Hey, y'all seen the temple lately? That thing is in a wreck, isn't it? It's like maybe we should rebuild that thing because it is a mess. And the people are like, man, I know it is bad, but I am so busy. I don't have the time. I don't know when I'd ever find the time to go over there and work on that. And so God says through the prophets, like, do you have time to work on your house? And they're like, oof, well, that hurt. It's like, you got time to do your stuff, but you don't have time to do God's stuff? It's not a time issue. It's a choice. It's coming to the point where we value him more than we value us. When we consistently put other things first, we say with our lives that Jesus is not superior. He's not worthy of our sacrifice. And such statements, even in behavior, maybe you're not saying it verbally, but even in our behavior, if we're saying that, there's grave consequences to that. And these behaviors are associated with drifting. So the writer of Hebrews goes on to say, chapter 2 and verse 2 through 3, it says, "For if the message spoken by angels was legally binding, and every transgression and disobedience received a just punishment, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation?" And so here's the argument he's making. So, hey, and the Hebrew people would have all agreed with this, that God used angels to relay the messages to the writers of the Old Testament Bible and the Old Testament books. And even Moses, they believed that up on Mount Sinai when he was getting the word, they believed that God used an angel to relay that. And so he's working off of that concept and he's saying, hey, if the message given by angels is so binding, is so certain that whenever you broke it, talking about the law, you received the punishment, how much more binding is it that the Son of God himself has delivered a word? If that came from angels was this binding, how much more? How much greater is this word that we've now gotten from the Son of God? And if we broke that word and we received the reward for that, the punishment for that, how much more so if we neglect something as great as this salvation? How much more punishment will we get? How will we escape that? And this neglect idea is just nothing more than a refusal to make Jesus supreme in our lives. And that's what it boils down to, coming back to the point where he actually has the value that he's supposed to have in our lives. And we neglect him, we drift away from him whenever we lose the awe of that relationship. And man, we've got to get back to that, where we come to the reality that, man, it is incredibly awesome that God wants to have a relationship with me. That today he wanted me to spend time with him. And sometimes I neglect that. And whenever we neglect something like that, we suffer. And he's telling us this. How are you going to escape? You're going to suffer if you neglect it. And so we neglect it. We neglect to maintain the awe. Sometimes we just lose it over the course of time. Nothing specific we did. It's just, you remember in the early days, maybe when you first came to Christ, maybe some of you came to Christ as an adult. Now, if you came to Christ as a child, your experience was different. But as an adult, then you understood the miraculous nature of the gift that God had given you. And it was emotional. And maybe you spent time in Scripture just weeping. And you couldn't wait to read it again and get some more. And it was just exciting. And you were on top of the world. And you couldn't wait to tell somebody else about it. And all those things factored in. And we were just in awe, just jaw-dropped awe that Jesus would love us. Because we knew, and we still know, that we're not all that lovable. And sometimes we start losing that awe. Man, that is a drift. That is a neglect. The other thing I'd say is the myriad of busyness. And again, we claim this in our society. And I've said it myself, man, I need 8 days a week and, 60 weeks a year. I need some more Saturdays. If you can figure out how to get more Saturdays, I'll sign up for that. And for whatever reason, I don't get any. You feel like you don't get any Saturdays? I don't know what happens. Every week it's just, man, I didn't get a Saturday this week. What? And it's like, well, next week. And then the next week comes, like, nope, something else happens. And we talk about how busy we are as a society, particularly here in America. It's amazing, too, because we really live a life of leisure. And we talk about how busy we are. Man, we're just so busy and all the time going and doing. And you didn't think about it. How much of that time is spent on the trivial? I mean, just the meaninglessness of life. And I'm not talking about your job. That might be medial task too, but just factor that off. Let's take that off the table, not your job. Just outside of that, the stuff that you do that really is just trivial. I mean, how much time do you spend on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, which is a new one for me. That's funny. It's ball games, television. It's hunting, Fishing. Yard work. No, that ain't all bad. Some of y'all probably all do some yard work. Get the blocks up under that car and do something, all right? Although it can go on. Leisure, just straight leisure. You know, I'm busy, man. I got to take a trip down, to the coast and sit on the beach. How busy are you again? And if I'm not taking a trip, I'm planning a trip. And if you take all of that stuff off your calendar, I got to run the kid down here to what? Well, to a ball game. Okay, take that off. Well, we got to go ice skating. Do you? Who's making you do that? Is that a law? That's not a law. Yeah, you don't have to do that. It's all this stuff that we got on. If you just take all that stuff off, then how much time would you have? How much money would you have? Shopping, let's put that on the list too, because I'm trying to think what you ladies do, because I know how much money I spend on hunting, and we don't want to talk about it. So we'll talk about shopping, Even online, I'm going to tell you what, Amazon's the best, worst thing we ever had. I've got more cardboard at my house than I've ever seen in my life. I don't know what to do with the boxes now. We fill up trailers with boxes from Amazon. I don't know how they make any money with all the cardboard they're sending me. And I don't think it's empty like my wife's telling me. I think there's stuff coming in there. All the time we spend shopping and, and again, we could go on down a list and you could think of things I hadn't thought of. Stuff we spend time on that is just trivial. No eternal value. Not bad. Not any of it's bad. But here's what happens. Whenever we begin to put the good stuff above the great stuff, it becomes the bad stuff. Whenever we're so involved in the good stuff that we don't have time for the great stuff, then it becomes the bad stuff. Whenever we give our attention so fully to the trivial stuff that we don't have time for God's stuff, then our problem is not that we're busy, it's that we're worldly. That's the problem. And it becomes sin. And we're full set adrift at that point. We're not anchored onto the value of Christ and the fact that we should be sacrificed for Him. And I'm not against any of the stuff I mentioned because I'm involved in all of it at some degree or another. I'm just thinking if we can't do the stuff that we should be doing because of that stuff, then we're missing the mark. We're messing up. And somewhere along the way, Jesus has lost value because we should be willing to sacrifice that stuff and anything else if necessary to maintain the stuff that is important to Him over the stuff that is important to us. And so finally, I'll say we neglect this great salvation oftentimes by neglecting spiritual disciplines in our lives. And again, it comes back to the busyness, it comes back to the loss of all, where we begin to drift away from the things that we know are right, the things that we know are healthy, the things that we know are good for our soul, because God said so in His Word. And so, this spending time in prayer, we pray before our meals, maybe you say a prayer when you go to bed, or, somewhere throughout the day, maybe it's like, God this or God that. But get back and read some George Mueller. Oh my goodness, hours of prayer. And I think, man, we've lost that in our society. And maybe there's somebody out there doing it, but it's not me. We've lost the idea where we just labor in the presence of God over prayer, and we have papers laid out with a prayer list. You wouldn't go to the grocery store without a list. And if you did, you'd come back and have to go back again. I mean, we make lists for our to-do list for today. We make lists for our honey-do list at the house. We've got lists for everything. And when this prayer thing, we're just winging that. I think you should have a prayer list. I think we should have a prayer list. I think there should be some idea of, hey, here's some things I definitely don't want to forget to pray for. And as you hear about things, you can add them to the list. And as God answers prayer, you can add praises to the list. And that should be an ongoing thing that we do, where it's not just random, haphazard, from the hip, as we feel led, but that we're actually having a spiritual discipline. We're disciplining ourselves to spend time at. Well, I don't have the time. Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. And if you don't, then you need to quit something. Would you agree with that? If we don't have time for prayer, we probably ought to quit something? Yeah. Bible reading, Go back to Romans chapter 12. He instructs us, we got to renew our mind, and if you don't, your mind is going to be worldly, and it's going to be temporary, and it's going to be darkened, and you're going to be drawn away. You're going to be adrift away from Christ mentally, and that's going to work its way out through your activities and your conversations, and so it's all connected. Whenever we begin to feed on the right stuff, it makes us healthy in here, which makes us live in a healthy way. whenever you stop feeding yourself regularly, then you start drying up spiritually. Worship, both corporate and private worship. Well, what does private worship look like? Well, it looks like a lot of things, man, but there should be some idea where each day you should be worshiping. You know, you can sing. Even if it don't sound good, you can sing. You might want to do it away from other people. Somebody might call you out. Yeah, work is worship if you do it right. Fasting, oof, we don't talk about that in the Baptist church, do we? That's a spiritual discipline they don't do anymore, right? No, it's still a thing. It's still a thing. It's still biblical. We don't talk about, for me, fasting is the time between breakfast and lunch. That's what fasting looks like in my life. And I'm not happy about that one. And I'm like, I need like the second breakfast and the second lunch and a snack here and there between them. The idea of fasting, man, that is a spiritual discipline that we have drifted away from as a society of believers because it's inconvenient. Because we don't like the way it feels. Man, we should bring that back. I should challenge each other to take a day this week and fast. Why not? Well, because it means I can't eat. That's right. That's what it means. And that's going to cost you something. But I'm telling you, we've got to get back to the idea of sacrifice in worship, where it becomes not about us and not that we got to put a show on for Jesus. It's not about a show on for Jesus. It's just about being able to discipline ourselves in spiritual things and say, hey, look, because I know it's right, because I know it's healthy, because I know it's good, I'm going to do it because I want to serve him to the best of my ability rather than serving me. Sharing your faith, we kind of drift away from that spiritual discipline as well. We must, the writer of Hebrews says, we must therefore pay even more attention, not less. We gotta pay more. We gotta double down, man. We've got to up the ante a little bit, man. The time's approaching and things are worse. He's talking to the Hebrew church. Yeah, you're going through persecution. It's not time to quit, back off, or slide away. It is time to double down on this. Pay more attention to what you've heard. You don't need something new. I'm not telling you anything new this morning. This is all the stuff you've already known. You don't need something new. You just need to do what you know to do. We need to pay more attention to what we've already heard. That Jesus is worthy because he is God. And that should affect the way we live our lives if we're going to be a Christian. We must therefore pay even more attention to what we have heard so that we will not drift, so that we do not neglect so great a salvation. Bow with me for just a moment. The call from Scripture this morning is simple. Anchor your soul in the value of Christ. Make him supreme in your life. Come back to that anchor point in your life where you can say again, yes, maybe I've drifted some, maybe I've gotten away from that, maybe I've not been living that out, but I want to come back to that this morning. I want to come back to the reality that Jesus is worth the sacrifice, and whatever that means. Because he's God. Because he's loved me desperately. Because he sacrificed himself for me. So in the quietness of your seat, I'm going to ask you to spend a moment in the presence of God. Ask yourself, where are you right now? Are you drifting or are you anchored? Are you out there just kind of doing life however you want to do it, whatever feels good, and you're just letting the emotions make the decisions? Or are you anchored to the fact that Jesus is worthy of whatever you have to give up, whatever you have to sacrifice, whatever the inconvenience might be? Father, this morning we bow in your presence and we realize that you are worthy. Whether we believe it, whether we claim it, whether we live it, it is true. God, our desire is to line ourselves up with that truth, to come back full center on the reality that my life should be different because of you, increasingly different. I should be growing in my sacrifice. God, help us to come back to the awe of your salvation, to the priority of your preeminence, God, to the spiritual disciplines that help keep us anchored on your supreme value. In the name of Jesus, we pray.